Glad he clarified that BS degree. I think there's a lot more folks up in Washington that have BS degrees than they'll let on. Anyway, well, it's good to be here. I always enjoy coming and talking to Farm Bureau crowd because I know this is a friendly crowd and folks that we speak the same language. I'm going to hit on some of the themes that my friend French talked about. But here's the thing about French. You know, he's from the 2nd District and fewer counties. I've got 30. What's he, like 6 or 7 counties? But here's the thing about French Hill is like, he's like a professor or something. If you want to get in a conversation with him, settle in. Because he knows his stuff. He knows what he's talking about. He knows the history. He knows the history of our institution. He knows the history of this country. And he's very well aware. But not only that, he's super well versed in these ag issues. And so, you know, the idea that, well, he's in the financial services sector and you wouldn't expect that depth of knowledge. No, he knows what he's talking about. And he had obviously a pretty big portfolio in agriculture in the southeast part of the state. And so he definitely is on our side. He knows what he's talking about. And we work very well together. And I appreciate him. And if you haven't already heard from Steve Womack, I'm sure you will. Bruce Westerman, I think he's scheduled to be here with y'all too. We have, I think, a great delegation and a great dynamic, and the way our delegation interacts and agriculture is certainly a prime concern. Let me talk about Cuba a little bit. Many of you know that I'm headed out to Cuba next week, and I have a bill that we are having some difficulty moving, and there are some political dynamics, and you can probably guess why. But there's joint jurisdiction and consideration for one thing. We think, and we think rightly so, we have primary jurisdiction in the Ag Committee on the Cuba Ag Trade bill. It's called the Cuba Agricultural Exports Act. Basically, it would amend the Trade Sanctions and Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000. This would lift the cash restriction, repeals the restriction on export financing. Gives U.S. producers access to USDA marketing programs to compete in foreign markets, which obviously is very important as it applies to Cuba. It enables limited U.S. investment in Cuba agribusinesses as well. That's also an important piece. Right now, we're up to about 24 co-sponsors, including our House Ag Committee Chairman, Mike Conaway. So that's good. We're making progress. We hope that after next week, we'll be able to make some more progress and garner some more support. I mentioned this in an interview earlier today. The Cuba thing is really a generational issue. Now, we've been doing this for 55 years. Now, who are we really trying to punish here? Because it's not working. Who we're punishing, basically, are U.S. producers and the Cuban people. We're keeping that barrier between you and a market that's important to you under the auspices of hurting the Castro regime. Well, they're ginning along now, 55 years into this posture, and nothing's changed. In fact, I would argue that we're doing more damage to ourselves by allowing the Castros to use us as the bad guys to vilify the United States and say, hey, look at what the United States is doing. They don't want to supply you any food. So we can address that very, very easily, very, very simply. And it's not an endorsement of the Castro regime, and I'll tell you why. Think back to China 1972. Think about China's record up to that point. Heck, think about their record up to now. But in 1972, Richard Nixon went to China, opened that market after there had been a prolonged embargo, and normalized to some degree trade with the nation of China. Well, that was a pretty big deal. What has transpired now since 1972 has been sort of a generational deal in that we've seen things change there tremendously. They now have a middle class. Again, not an endorsement of the Chinese administration by any means at all. But when we export our goods to a foreign country, we also export an ideal with those goods. The ideals of freedom and life, liberty, and property. Those kinds of things are important, and that's when you see a burgeoning middle class emerge in places like China. Can we do the same thing in Cuba? I would think absolutely. It's not going to happen overnight. Didn't happen overnight in China. But we had to take those first steps. So history dictates that we're on the wrong side on this particular issue, as was demonstrated with the posture that we had with China, and it was Richard Nixon that helped tear down that trade barrier. And yet we have allowed this vestige of the Cold War to linger now for some 55 years. Time to run a new play, as my friend Senator Bozeman would say. You don't keep running the same play over and over again when you don't get any yardage from it. If he hasn't spoken to you already today, he will, and he'll use that line, so be prepared. That's Cuba. I think it's important that we do engage Cuba, but I think it's also important that we revisit the issue of free trade and what that means. We use the term free trade and fair trade interchangeably. They're not the same thing. We need to discard this notion of free trade and plug in fair trade and how that impacts you. Let me get to, you heard a very good explanation from French Hill about TPA. In fact, I had him on, for those of you who don't know, I do a weekly video blog. I don't really call it a television show because it's not televised, but you can find it on YouTube, Facebook, and other video media that we have it out there on. And several months ago, I had French Hill on and had him help us kind of get into the weeds on TPA, what it is, and how folks have sort of conflated TPA and TPP, two completely separate things. Without TPA, we wouldn't have known what was in TPP. So it was important that we did grant TPA authority to the president so we could actually have access to see what was in TPP. And I'll tell you this, I don't like what's in TPP. Now, in Arkansas, we have a very diverse ag economy. Now, folks on the west side of the state and in the west side of my district, they don't necessarily like me to say this per se, but the reality is that TPP, there's just so few of us that are advocating for the rice industry that this is not a deal I can get comfortable with. It may be okay for the protein sector, but on balance, it's a big loser for us in Arkansas when you weigh in how rice is treated. We need to be about expanding market access for commodities like rice, and we're losing it under TPP. You know, if the Japanese are generous with us and they say, well, we'll take our tariff from 700% down to 500%, what favor have they done us? And then we lose in Mexico because Vietnamese comes in at zero tariff. We've really taken a real hit under TPP in that scenario. I'm not necessarily against TPP in theory. I'm against this deal, and I think we can do better. In fact, I think that when we start to involve these big multilateral trade agreements and trying to acquiesce to the demands of every other nation, as a nation, we lose. I think we would be better served to engage in bilateral trade agreements and work these deals out nation to nation without having to accommodate every single cultural issue that exists. I'll give you an example, South Korea. The rice industry, again, took it on the chin, took one for the team with the idea that they're going to tee up a position in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that will allow greater access in the Pacific Rim. Didn't materialize. So we continue to ask rice to take one for the team, and they continue to do it, and yet we don't see the market access materialize. I think we would be better served, as I said, to start to look at these fair trade deals through a bilateral lens as opposed to continuing to try and hit these grand slam plays on something like TPP. I think that we do need greater access in the Pacific Rim, no question about it. But I think we can do it and do it more efficiently and more fairly by doing it in a bilateral way. And another thing that I think needs to be talked about, it's not talked about enough, is the consideration that certain nations are given with respect to developing economies or developed economies. We're a developed economy. Well, I would argue that Brazil is a developed economy. If you can spend millions and millions of dollars investing in a port in Cuba, I think you've arrived. I think it's time for you to step up to the plate and start to operate on the same playing field that we here in the United States have to operate. China, same deal. There's so much going on in foreign play. Heck, I'm hearing talk about China trying to develop an alternative to the Panama Canal. That's a developing economy? I don't think so. So we need to level this playing field at the WTO. What can I do about it legislatively? Nothing. I can write some strongly worded letters, and you see what that gets us. But the reality is the WTO really serves as an institution to to really punish the United States, quite frankly. It's disconcerting to me, just like the UN. I mean, we fund the bulk of it, and yet we receive, the worst treatment. And there are two examples right there. I mean, we're a developed nation, and so we're treated differently than countries like Brazil and China. Come on, let's get into the real world now. When you've got nations like Brazil and China that are actively engaged in investing in other countries, they have become a developed economy, and they should be treated as such. So I'll move on to my next rant. U.S. cottonseed designation. I'll tell you, this is a tough one because statutorily the Secretary of Agriculture has the authority to address this issue. He refuses to. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of this, but I'm going to, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at the Cotton Belt and you lay these cotton-producing states out on the map, and then you take a look at the political dynamics of that region, cotton is a decidedly red crop. Now you tell me that there's not a political dynamic that exists in dealing with this cottonseed issue when he has the clear authority to address it in the Farm Bill. Now then our option is that we can go back into the Farm Bill and open that up and provide greater clarity. Huge mistake. Because as soon as we open that Farm Bill up, we open up a can of worms that we can't fix. I want to try and get this cottonseed issue addressed, but I'm afraid we're not going to be able to as long as this Ag Secretary is intransigent, and he is. He doesn't want to do it. I would dare say that if this was a corn issue, it would have been done already, but it's not. And so the politics at play are as such, and that is having everything to do with our ability to move this easy fix on this cottonseed deal. That's not to imply that the Stacks program, I'm not endorsing it or maligning it in either case, but I am saying this can be fixed, and it can be fixed easily, and that he just doesn't have the political will or desire to do it. Let me talk about clean line energy. This is another example of the federal government going around the will of the people at the state level. The state was perfectly capable and should have been left to address this issue on our own without the intrusion of the federal government. And they're using, I don't remember the exact statute on it, but our entire delegation has weighed in on this. What we continue to see at the federal level is, again, the overreach of a centralized federal government that's intruding into the state's ability to do what they need to do in their state. We know better than you do. So here's how it's going to be. It's very clear what the 10th Amendment says, and we've gotten way off track with regard to how states are treated from the perspective of the federal government. And I think our delegation is in lockstep in that, and that we're doing everything we can to continue to push back. Our entire delegation met with Department of Energy Secretary Moniz. It's been a couple of months ago. It's a fine, friendly meeting, but obviously you see the end result was that they basically came in there, a little bit of lip service, pat us on the head and say thank you, and then go about and do what they intended to do in the first place. This is not in keeping with respect for states and our ability to make those decisions on our own. Talk about foreign aid real quick and PL 480. What we want to see is that as we start to see food aid administered, that we want to make sure that rice is included. I don't want to stand up here and make you guys think that I'm a one-trick pony and all I care about is rice. That's not the case. I have a broad view of agriculture, and I'll get to that in just a minute, but we also have to understand that on balance, there's very little support for rice. Y'all need all the help you can get. It's important to our state. It's not just important to my district, it's important to our state. 50% of the U.S. rice crop is produced in Arkansas, and about 99% of it's in my district. If I'm not standing up for rice, who is? Somebody's got to, and I don't want to make y'all think that I don't care about the livestock sector. That's where I got my practical experience, was in the cattle business. I had to learn the row crop stuff. I've had a lot more experience in the cattle business, and not just in the rodeo business either, but actually in some feedlot management and cow-calf operations as well. So I speak your language too, but y'all have a lot more support than the rice folks do. And so I want to make sure that you know that I'm on your side in all these regards, but there just needs to be a little more attention paid to rice, and then PL 480 is one of those areas where we can do better and give them greater access. Let me talk about one other thing, and cattlemen, I'll mention your vulture problem here in a sec to let you know I know what you're dealing with on that one too. GMO labeling. Y'all, we missed a big, big opportunity on GMO labeling. We went the wrong direction with GMO labeling. First off, I don't think it's an issue as a consumer. I don't buy the junk science that says that GMOs are dangerous, because they're not. And if we've got 300 million people, thank you. We got to feed 300 million people in this country alone. We've got to rely on science and technology to meet the demands of this nation alone, let alone, the billions of people in the world that are going to require on us and other countries to feed them. So yes, we need to have sound science when we're talking about these issues. But we went about this the wrong way. I think the smarter way would have been to have created a certification program for non-GMO products. Create a market niche. You want to pay a premium for a non-GMO product? More power to you. I'm okay with the GMO stuff because I'm on a budget. I'm trying to feed my family on a budget. I'm not getting a warm fuzzy feeling because I'm buying USDA organic certified and USDA non-GMO certified. But if you've got the disposable income and you feel good about that, more power to you. That's a market niche. That's where we should have been with GMO labeling, is letting the market decide where that label needed to be. Now what we've done is create a dynamic where Vermont is dictating policy for the entire nation. I tell you what, we had this conversation earlier today. I'd like to see companies like General Mills and others that just say, you know what, Vermont, it's been nice, but we're not going to deal with you anymore. Vermont is in a position now that if you go and shop in New Hampshire and bring those products back to Vermont, you as the consumer are going to be fined. What is wrong with this picture? We missed the boat on this one big time, and I don't know that we can back it up and fix this problem, but we certainly don't need to be allowing a small state like Vermont to develop and dictate policy for the entire nation as it applies to GMO labeling. That's a huge mistake, and we're going to have to fix this. And on to the black vulture problem. That was quite a segue. Listen, I know what you're dealing with on these black vultures, and I know, again, you've got the federal government intruding because of Fish and Wildlife. And then the enforcement mechanism doesn't make sense either, where you're going to have FSIS come in and tell you, levy fines or fees or whatever. Something's got to be done about that. We're going to try and get, I know that it's, this 30 vulture permit thing, and, you got to pay $100 for it, and it's ridiculous. And certainly not just an Arkansas problem. They have this problem out west, and we're going to do what we can to try and get a depredation order from Fish and Wildlife. That's a tall order, I'll be honest with you. But we're going to do what we can to support that and try to eliminate that need for permits and so on, and we'll continue to work with folks who are dealing with that issue. But I've seen it. I know about it. I've seen it firsthand. I know what that does and how costly that can be. And then, trying to make a claim under the LIP and get some restitution there is also, cost prohibitive in most cases. So we'll continue to work on that. That's kind of where I am on agriculture. I'm very passionate about agriculture. But I want to leave you with this before we go into questions. And I had this question asked to me earlier. What can we do to try and advance agriculture? I'm going to tell you in the broadest terms, and we have folks in here, and you can always tell the difference. You see guys wearing cowboy hats and you see the guys not wearing cowboy hats. That's the difference. You got row crop over here and you got cattlemen over here. There's a fundamental divide there. You want to buy the corn low, they want to sell it to you high. That's fine. That's fine. But in the ag industry, there's too few of you to have these battles in public. What we need to do as an industry is coalesce around a set of ideas that advance the entire agriculture industry and take this out in the court of public opinion and start to win these battles. because y'all are getting beat up. You're getting beat up with junk science. You're getting beat up with a bunch of pop culture that doesn't understand where their food and fiber comes from. And then here we are fighting amongst ourselves while we're getting killed out here. I don't know what those issues are. If we could come up with 5 things that we all agree on and move out here outside and sell this to the general public, we would be much better served. And when we have our disagreements, we close those doors and we disagree and we figure out what's the best path forward. But we need to figure out a way to advance the entire ag industry and do it in a productive way that reaffirms the relationship between the producer and the consumer, and do it in a positive way. And if we don't do that, things are not going to get better for us as an industry. So help me help you in that regard. And this is something that I didn't just cook this up on the way in here. This is something I've been doing as an ag professional, as an ag communicator. And Mitchell Nail, who is my ag liaison in the back, he and I actually, we did this years ago in the Ag Watch Network. We set aside a program per day that was dedicated to just that, because we knew at this particular day part on these radio stations that were music formatted, we had an audience, a consumer audience. So we set about trying to educate that consumer audience about those issues. We weren't getting into the weeds on technical things. We weren't talking about market stuff. We were talking about what affects their market basket goods and their quality of life as it applies to food and fiber. And we were trying to build that bridge even 10, 15 years ago. But we have got to get aggressive about doing that, or this industry loses. So help me come up with some ideas that we can move forward with, and I'll gladly carry the flag forward for you and with you, and we can go and win in the court of public opinion. With that, I'll leave it there, and we'll take questions. I appreciate y'all so much. Sir.
Do you think, I'm Nathan Gregory.
Yes, sir.
Coming here today. Do you think that electrovoltaic cells are going to be more prevalent to produce electricity in Arkansas?
Well, they can be, and I dabbled in this a little bit a few years back. It's hard for us to get the kind of reliable level of electricity for things like large-scale agriculture, irrigation, for example. You couldn't get the gallons per minute that you need. But for other applications, most certainly. And I think what you have to balance this with is you're going to take some land out of production to achieve that. So I think there's definitely room for it.
Could I follow up?
Sure.
The kind of photovoltaic cell array that I'm talking about, I get flyers from people who want to use my land to put 40 acres of photovoltaic cells out there.
Mm-hmm.
And hook it up to the electric grid, whoever's there, whether it's energy or some co-op. And you would benefit by them buying your photovoltaic energy
Mm-hmm.
from your farm. I'm assuming it'd be some kind of lease.
Yeah.
Have you heard of it?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing it in large scale. If you've ever driven on I-40 between Memphis and Nashville, over around Jackson, UT's got a great big farm. I'm going to say it's probably in the 40-acre range of solar panels out there. It's right on the north side of the interstate. I definitely think it's viable. Again, you've got to balance that with that acreage that you take out of production. Is the return there? And you've got to do the math on it. But I think that what you'll find is, companies like Energy and our rural electric co-ops, they'll certainly benefit from that. And you just got to do the math on whether or not that benefits your operation. But I support it. What I don't think that we're going to see is a long-term sustainment of production tax credit. And I think the reason that I think that you won't see that is because over time, again, you get back into a situation where you're picking winners and losers, and that's the mistake that goes on in Washington. We don't need to be doing that. So I think that you can't count on the production tax credit as your incentive to do it. So you've got to pencil this out on your own and find out, is in the absence of the production tax credit, does this make sense for me financially? And if it does, I'd say go for it. That's the other thing, and that's also going to be subject to that PTC. And if you can make that cash flow in the absence of the PTC, I would say go for it.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. I know this is going to be good.
You put a lot of pressure on the fellow, you know it. Rick, appreciate you being here and appreciate you being an advocate for agriculture. We talk about the election coming up and the lame duck session. Take us through this next year, and what do you see happening as far as legislation? And kind of a dovetail off of that, the farm program, and not just for row crop, but for livestock also. They've kind of driven us all in the same catch pen, crop insurance, livestock indemnity, on and on. And the last time, I guess, we were in Washington, we were hearing already that they were wanting to cut that budget.
Oh, yeah.
The president's budget has it in there, and it has been cut every time he brings a budget out. Agriculture seems to be a second thought. Do you see any of those cuts in this lame duck session, and what do you foresee as far as the ag budget through this next year?
Well, a couple of things. First off, you know that we haven't passed a budget yet out of the House. The clock's ticking. We've got to do that. That budget is probably going to have about a $30 billion cut. They're going to come to ag and ask for a big chunk of that out of the ag committee. Now, as you know, our chairman, Mike Conaway, has been a pretty strong advocate and protector of keeping that farm bill closed. I don't think we're going to have that luxury this time around. We're going to have to go in there and make some cuts. The reason that we have to do that is because these are going to be out of mandatory spending, so we can't just kick it over to appropriations and let them do it. So we're kind of playing our cards pretty close to the vest right now in terms of what those cuts are going to look like and where they're going to do the most damage, because we don't want to throw something out there now just to have to pick those cards back up. In fact, we may not be in that situation. I think what we're likely going to see is another CR. I just don't think there's enough time, and certainly not on the Senate side, to get appropriations done and see that going forward. I think what we're going to see is another CR. So if there's some good news in there, it may be that current levels just sort of continue. The bad news is we need to be doing a budget and appropriations and getting back to regular order, but we're just not there. And so I just have to be candid with you. I think that the likely scenario will be another CR. And that's why we don't want to put those cards out on the table to show anything if we don't have to. But we're on notice that they're going to cut deep in the ag budget. So there's that. I don't like that. Mike Conaway has been a stalwart on trying to protect the farm bill, and he'll continue to be. But this is just what's being dictated, and we'll see. But he's been very clear about not getting out there with what those cuts would be so that we don't position ourselves to have to actually do damage if we don't need to. So, hope that answers your question. Now, as far as the lame duck goes, oh golly, this election year is maybe one of the ugliest we've seen in a long time. And so you've got to decide, which one of these candidates do you think from, when you're viewing these issues through the lens of your, through your ag goggles, which one of these candidates is best for agriculture? None of them. And just be honest with you. None of them really understand or care beyond winning the Iowa caucus. That's the extent of their interest in agriculture. And I'll just be blunt with you. That's just how it is. And I'll tell you, since we're talking about Iowa, and I don't mean to malign my friends in Iowa, but I think Chuck Grassley may have been jilted by a Southern belle at some point in his time, because he does not like Southern agriculture. So that's unfortunate. But there is a very huge geographic disconnect in U.S. ag policy. And it falls right on the Mason-Dixon line. And I'm sorry to evoke that imagery, but the truth of the matter is that's where ag policy lives right now. And when you continue to see the big eyes drive ag policy, the big eyes being Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, Southerners are going to pay for that. And I'm cooking up some ideas to help mitigate that to some degree. Time will prohibit me from getting into the weeds on some of this stuff. Some of you have had these conversations with, but I think there are some things we can do differently to enhance our position as Southerners when it comes to ag policy. But look, again, this is not a DNR deal. This is a North and South deal, bottom line. And quite frankly, there's a big disconnect in East and West. You know, and for some folks who have been in ag production out West, totally different dynamic out there too. So this one-size-fits-all that's geared toward this cluster of Midwestern states, it doesn't work for everybody. It just doesn't. So we got to broaden our scope and start to recognize that grazing cattle on BLM land is a completely different proposition than throwing out a handful of soybeans, getting a 50-bushel yield, farming for crop insurance, and you got some mama cows over here, and you work in town at factory, and your wife is a teacher, and you've got 2.2 kids that help you on the farm. Because not all farms operate that way. So I hope that answered your question. It probably didn't, but
You mentioned clean line. Is that a dead issue?
Clean line's not a dead issue in the fact that we're not going to let it die to the extent that we can keep that issue front and center and try and win that battle. Look, it's this simple. If a private landowner wants to enter into private treaty for those easements, that's fine, but he shouldn't be compelled to do so. And the Department of Energy used their authority to invoke eminent domain against the wishes of the state of Arkansas. That's it. Clear cut, and we just can't, roll over and die on that deal. So we're going to keep pushing back on that.
Crawford, I'm from Dan Wright from Scott County. I'm in a poultry business. I'm on the state board here. You're getting a lot of poultry in your district.
Oh yeah, they're moving over to get to the corn.
Yeah. Some of the issues we have in the poultry industry is risk management. We don't have a safety net.
Right.
If we lose a flock of chickens, we just lost a flock of chickens and the amount of money that went with it. The risk management RMA did a study recently and found that it was not feasible to have a safety net for poultry industry. Do you foresee a chance of changing that? I know the insurance has a deal, and the fact that we don't actually own the chickens
Right.
is also affects it.
Yeah, was it last month we had this conversation, had a little round table up there in D.C. about this and what we need to do, and I think there may be some way to create. The integrators are really they have the scale and the actuary base that they could come to the table and say, here's how you do a livestock or a poultry insurance product. So that's where I think RMA may have missed the boat. When they say it's not feasible, it may not be feasible to write on your farm per se, but it could be feasible to write overall for the integrators, and the integrators could then buy up that. At some point, you're still going to be financially liable. They'll pass that on to you, but it would be cheaper because they have the base to be able to do it. Does that make sense? So that's where I think they may have just sort of gave up a little too soon. I think we can do that, take another look at it and see if that doesn't work. But that's another one of those things that, we need to remain diligent on.
Congressman, I got a follow-up on that Dan brought up. It was in a provision in the 2014 Farm Bill that they do that study, that RMA do that study on poultry industry and with catastrophic event happening in the poultry industry. And they delayed it a lot longer than the Farm Bill said to start with. And then they fell in behind where we'd had some incidents in Minnesota and Iowa. And actually, it looks like the study, actually, I thought the comments on the study went further than they should have for one reason, on one side of that, and actually looked like that RMA was trying to drive a nail in the coffin for poultry on the onset. I mean, it did not really, it put it in a way that completely almost slammed the door on it.
Mm-hmm.
We think that it's a doable deal for sure. It should be a doable deal. And we think we would like for you and give us some instruction and help to get where that RMA takes another look at this and get producer input on this product, this risk management product for our poultry and all of our livestock industry. We don't have enough risk management products for our livestock industry. But the study did more to hurt us than it did to help us in any way. And to me, that was, they went over their way in that went overboard on that study. But I also don't think they got the right input in that study to come up with a really feasible answer. There's a way to work around that of who owns the birds and when they own them.
Right.
Without a doubt.
That's to me, that's the direction they need to go. We will front burner this thing to the extent that you will help us do that. So what I would ask our poultry producers is, being specific, help us develop a white paper on this that we can submit with some language that you, look, I've come up with bills that were written on napkins because of ideas that I had at a coffee shop with farmers saying, here's what we need, and they'll jot it down. That's helpful. But I know that that there's sufficient brain trust in this room that you can come up with what exactly you need for us to carry forward, and we'll do that. So what I'm saying is, I don't want to write something that doesn't pass muster with you guys. So if you'll help us do that, that would be the next logical step in helping us move and try and get them to rethink that approach. Because, like I said, you said that they delayed getting started, and then it was a quick deal. So they took forever to start the thing, and then it was like, our findings are this. And like you said, I think that's actually more harm than good. So.
Well, if we're going to be tweaking the risk management and crop insurance, there also needs to be, like in our area of the country, Chico County, the deadline for starting to plant corn is not feasible for us because we start the 1st of March.
Right.
Where we had corn already in the ground, we got 22 inches of rain, we lost all that corn, but it was 6 or 7 days too soon for crop insurance for it to be viable for us.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's the same scenario you were talking about. What's good for me is not good for somebody else.
Well.
But there's so many things that need to be tweaked.
Mm-hmm.
And I think crop insurance only truly helps the crop insurance salesman.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
Well, you make a good point, and I've had this conversation. In fact, I think we had it in the truck coming down here. We have a lot of resources at our disposal that we don't utilize. For example, our cooperative extension service. We entrust our extension agents with a lot of things. For example, they can certify you on restricted use pesticide. Why couldn't we utilize them to certify a certain planting date that's based on a geography where it makes sense? We can do those kinds of things. We just don't. And the reason we don't is because this policy is dictated by a certain geography, and it doesn't take into account the differences that exist. Look, you can plant a heck of a lot sooner in certain latitudes than you can in others. So it would make sense that the certification process deadlines are on somewhat of a sliding scale, and that certification can be done by utilizing the authority of the extension agents who we entrust with a lot of things. We talked about, certifying whether a black vulture death is actually a black vulture killed it or whether the calf died and then they ate it. Well, the extension agent can make that certification. That's one thing we're thinking, why are we having to go through all this process? Why do you need to take this carcass over to a vet and let him do an autopsy on it to certify that it was in fact killed by black vultures so that you can make your LIP claim, and you've already incurred $250 in transportation and autopsy fees, and maybe you'll net out $200, maybe, if you're lucky. Same thing here. Why can't we let our extension agents do some of that for us? Now, I know they got a lot on their plate, but it's not too much to ask that you could set a date at a county level and let them certify that.
The county extension agent
Yeah.
which have nothing to do with trying to help a farmer, and during the times that we really need them, they're speaking before garden clubs. And I'm all about the garden clubs, I think that's nice and everything, but not when you need somebody to come out there and tell you what you need to do on your farm.
It's a question of priorities at a particular time of the year and what their primary mission is.
Well, there needs to be a county extension agents for the ladies in the schools, and then there needs to be somebody that helps the farmer.
Well, I'm not going down that road, but I hear you. I agree with you that we can do better in trying to address a certification for a deadline that makes sense for a certain latitude. And I agree with that 100%. What else we got? Well, guys, it's a privilege to represent you. I know I have the first district, but I really have all of y'all at heart all the time, and I appreciate the opportunity to work for you. Thank y'all so much.